Je crois qu'on pourrait commencer.
I
Qu'est-ce que
think
toi?
we can start now. What do you think? As you wish. Right. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to this last 154 forum, Crafting Worlds for a Vernacular Economy of Art. And today we're talking about meeting and unmaking art schools, and we are exploring and retracing via historic approach the complex way that we have transmission infrastructure in the institution of schools, especially the ones taken on the African continent, and especially art schools. And we can see how it's deployed in Western Africa, namely in Egypt. Before we begin, I would like to apologize to those who tried to watch the Senbene film last night. We had technical issues that we are currently resolving, so we will tell you on the social networks what platform you can use to watch the film and when it will become available. But to get back to today's topic, I'm sure it will resonate very much with yesterday's event. Let us explore youth and the impact of Western and colonial training in various contexts on the African continent, as well as how collective artists have navigated this context and this dominating structure, to then question how various stakeholders, both in the past and now, tried to remake this infrastructure. In some way, they tried to refound it in a very contextual manner. Before we present our two guests of today, I would wish to underline that this transmission and training and education topics within the context of art are very dear to our hearts, as they are in many different projects and for many stakeholders that we are close to. For example, in Morocco, there is a foundation in Marrakech that is working to give a place to the transmission, the popular transmission of this type of art. There's also a Mahala cultural space who is doing research on invisible education. And there is another project that is ongoing around Casablanca. And this has already begun. It started in 2015, and it involves a training program called Madrasa. This has been the framework that allowed me to meet AUDE and NADINE for the first time, and it's a pleasure for me to see them here today. Then in 2016, we co-founded a collective known as Madrasa Collective, together with 5 other people. And this resonates with our topic today because our collective aimed to self-train. This became more tangible over time. And we questioned what it meant to be a collective through practice, through experimenting, and through what we would call reciprocal contamination. Now, today, when we speak of Madrasa Collective, we do speak of it in the past or as a finished project. But this round table, this form of exchange, is something that was built amongst the different members of the collective. And I think there is a lot of wealth in the collective space, even though it can be marginal. Even beyond the art world, these collectives are able to rethink ways of doing things, ways of learning, and ways of transferring culture. Now, let me present to you our participants who are much more established in these topics than me. Nadine ATALLAH works in the Paris University and at the Sorbonne in a laboratory. She looks at the contribution of women to modern audiovisual arts in Egypt. She looks at various topics, and she also develops the history of feminist art. She has curated several modern art exhibitions, including In Conversation, a painting show at the American University in Cairo in 2019. And beyond the Madrasa Collective, she's also worked in art galleries in Paris and Beirut. Then we have AUDE Kristel Mcbar. She is an independent curator and art historian based between the Netherlands and Cameroon. She was a participant of the APALLAH in 2018 to 2019. She is also co-curator of Sunspeak 1920 to 1924, which is an international quadrennial in the city of Arnhem, if I am not mistaken. So thank you very much, AUDE and Nadine, for being here with us today. First and foremost, I would like to ask each of you to briefly tell us about your research and your practice, namely with respect to education and the transmission of knowledge. Nadine, perhaps we can start with you. Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Francesca, for this invitation. As you said, I'm currently doing a PhD that examines women in Egypt rather in the modern period, so not too far back in time with respect to the contemporary thread in 54. In narratives, we see a lot in the works carried out in modern art in universities in Europe and in the States. And here we see that actually modern art starts in 1908. We see this date a lot because that was the foundation of the modern art school, or the fine art school in Cairo. It was an academic institution in the beginning of modern art, because before there was no modern artistic expression. Now, it's an open topic, but what I'm interested in is that in 1908, the fine arts were only open to men. As I work on women, I wanted to question this line of thought, because the history of fine arts is written in the masculine. Women only arrive at the school in the beginning of the 1950s. This means that there's a whole other history, almost a parallel history of women in modern art that is yet to be written. This is why I wanted to question this history of arts education that is specific to women. In the meanwhile, then, so before the 1950s, there were other modes of transmission of teachings in terms of art, both formal and informal, that were accessible to women, but it depended on their ability to go and stay abroad, so go to train in European institutions, or their ability to access private studios of artists. Therefore, there was a very significant socio-economic filters that would do a triage of the women who were able to access this arts world, whereas for men, this was often free. So there's a difference between the socio-economic profile of men and women at that time, and it's quite astounding. So as we look back at this history of teaching, I wondered about documentation and archives and what exists during this very revolutionary period, that is to say pre-1950s, that is available in the National Archive Institute in Cairo. But it's very difficult. The schools themselves say they have no archive, it's difficult to access it. There are very difficult procedures. So I went through the press mainly, and I worked on subscriptions to arts trade unions to go back to the first women who received diplomas in institutions to trace their history following interviews. That's it for me. Thank you very much. So Samba, who was at a different event, discussed cinema. Samba discussed the violent expropriation of language perpetrated by colonial education. And we also talked about the absence of resources in the West in the teaching curricula. And they talked about their own trajectory as well. I think AUDE has been looking at similar things, similar topics. She's looking at how our personal trajectories are based on lacks or limits in terms of education and educational institutions, which remain very much anchored to Western ways. So, Gord, could you tell us more about the main axes of your work and how your own training led you to focus on such educational institutions as well as the language used within the context of art? Thank you, Francesca. Before I start, I also want to thank everybody, the whole 154 team, for this invitation. Indeed, training and education is a topic that has interested me for personal reasons. Yes, we've talked about the history of art, but before that, I actually went to a painting school where I received arts training. They offered secondary education in painting and sculpture and ceramics. I went there and I received a whole artist/technicians training, and I was in the painting or fine arts module. There were many programs offered. We had many sources of inspiration. There were references to the history of art that were transmitted to us. And I was curious to find out, for example, why when we speak of art history, there's no intersection between the different geographies. I mean, we feel like as though art belongs to the West, belongs to Europe, and in prehistory as well. It was presented to us as such. For example, we talk about the great civilizations, Egypt having had a great civilization, but a Western one, it's presented as such.
So we can look at various countries and trace the way in which Western teaching evolved. When I finished my training route, I had the idea that this sort of training didn't exist in Africa, and I had to really inspire myself through Western authors. When I got to university, my outlook changed a little bit because the arts department, it was history the arts and history department in Cameroon was actually founded by anthropologists, and these individuals were interested in African history and anthropology. So this meant that this aspect really influenced the way in which the history of art was being taught. There was a real interesting focus on some of the cultural elements, the pre-colonial elements that had influenced the anthropologists. we were able to see how different tribes had offered themes that could be investigated from an artistic point of view. It was a real surprise for me. I thought, wow, such a rich world of influences. Why aren't these actually being brought into other teaching arenas? It was something that I could really compare with the traditional routes that I'd seen up to that point, and something almost taboo, if you like. So it really got me thinking about artistic movements and the way in which art was being taught. This led me to start investigating the whole issue of art education, and I started to think about how people were being trained and look at different perspectives. It led me to also investigating the question and the issue of interest in various issues that could be investigated within artistic training. I started, therefore, to really go into this investigation, and I've now um, finished part of my work on the project um, that I called My Learning is Affected by the Condition of
Bah,
My
j'aimerais
Life. It's an
justement
ongoing
parler
project,
de ce
really.
projet
I'd like you to talk a little
dont
bit about this
je parle, oui,
project,
de
please.
My Learning is
Aude,
Affected by the
My
Condition of My
Learning is
Life.
Affected by the Condition of
Oui,
My
en
Life,
particulier la recherche historique
particularly the
qui est développée.
historical research
D'ailleurs,
that you did.
on retrouve aussi un article
We
qui t'a publié
find an
récemment
article
sur
that was
le
published
site de Studio
recently
Generale. Je vais
in Studio
laisser
Generale. I'm going
le lien
to
dans la chat pour ceux
give you
qui
the
veulent
link to this
regarder.
in the chat box if you're interested in looking into it. But I wanted to ask you to explain a little bit about your project,
Et des manifestations
what
physiques
inspired
de
you,
formes de
the
production de
physical
produits sur le savoir
manifestations as
précolonial
well.
dans le contexte qui t'a
When you
été
looked into the
très spécifiquement,
pre-colonial
d'une part, mais aussi
influences, and then
comment,
also
oui, l'impact de
how
la création de
you
l'école en
look
tant
at the
qu'institution
impact
occidentale
of art
et
teaching and the
coloniale
creation of
ou
schools
entre autres sur la
on
création même
creation
des nouveaux
itself, artistic
nations de
creation and
l'art et de
artistic
l'artiste,
works.
voilà, au
So
Cameroun
perhaps you'd be
et
able to
en
tell us
Afrique
a
de
little bit
l'Ouest
about that in
particulièrement.
Cameroon and in Africa in a more general sense. Yes, so I started working on My Learning is Affected by the Tradition of My Life through an invitation that I had through the Studio Generale. And this is one of the institutions in our country, and it has linked to various universities. It hosts artistic events and actually tries to forge links between the professional arts scene and student artists. So I had this invitation through this organization, and this really allowed me to launch the project. It was a response to one of the studies they were carrying out. They're still working on it at the moment, in fact. I was particularly interested in the issue of the future of art schools. So the real interest for me was linked to my own questioning about what I envisage as being the future of art schools and art teaching, all the issues that I had looked at, all the criticism that can come in when it comes to the way in which art education is organized, how the discipline is actually viewed and put together. So I started to reflect upon this and really ask myself the question about what an art school really means. How do we define arts teaching? What is the idea of the school itself as an institution? How do we look at this in the past and now? And particularly in the African context, we can talk about Charlemagne and historical references, and we can try to look at now how this still influences teaching and study. So I started doing some research on people who had written about this issue, the pre-colonial schools, and how art was being taught and how people were being trained before my research idea wasn't necessarily to actually put together a genealogy as such, but it was more to try to find key elements that it really interested me and to put these forward as elements that could help us look to the future of art schools. So, the community and collective aspects of creative projects in the African scenario. I can take an example that Dr. Chandu actually put forward. I asked this individual to answer some questions for my research, and they talked about the Shumam experience. Um, it's a type of writing that exists in the Baroun area of Cameroon, and it's a tribal influence, and so there was a sort of investigation of this type of artistic production and the way in which the chiefs of the tribe influenced this. There were various collaborative elements at play here. Um, so I actually could go into this a bit and see how these traditions and this artistic teaching was passed on. The link between the material realm and the spiritual realm in this particular context. This was one of my collaborative projects. And then another example was linked to dream works and the idea of having a protocol linked to an artistic vision and the institutionalization of this kind of artistic writing. I involved other individuals in this study as well, and I tried to really look at how various traditional writings and artistic media were passed on from person to person, and how a kind of archive could be put together. These are some of the examples that interested me in my project. I also wanted to look at the impact of the Western schools. So, not only art schools, but also Western education and culture, even in a pre-colonial sense. And what influences came in from this arena in terms of the African context of passing on artistic knowledge. There were some elements that actually have disappeared. So, for example, my father told me about how the colonial schools came in and how language became a real issue. So, they were forced to speak a colonial language, another language, and of course, this came into the education system. So, how did this affect things? And how is this being looked at today in terms of the way in which people express themselves through their languages? I think this is also a relevant issue. So, how do we pass things on from generation to generation in the sense of language? The colonial school is also therefore important to consider in an interdisciplinary sense. How did our grandparents' generation learn, for example? How was learning passed on from generation to generation during that time? If we look at music, painting, sculpture, there are all sorts of issues here in terms of what happened within local societies. There was maybe a more holistic vision at play, but then there was a kind of division that came in terms of the various disciplines. We can maybe have, therefore, an investigation of the transdisciplinarity of the art word, and then the way in which people were being trained as, if you like, comprehensive cultural beings. And then we had the division of schools. So it was compartmentalized a lot more, the artistic arena. I think all these issues are quite interesting when we look at art schools in general, when we look at the different influences, for example, from music. I talked to my father a lot about that in terms of the language issue as well, the influence of English language music these days, for example, the fact that it's maybe more inaccessible to try to find older recordings and things in a family language. So all these issues are very interesting, I think, when it comes to cultural influences, choreography, musical instruments, performance arts. and even the costumes that are being used within the artistic arena and within performance spaces. All these things are some of the issues I wanted to investigate with this project. My learning is affected by the condition of my life. I know I've spoken a lot. I can speak for ages on this subject, but oh, yes, absolutely. We're going to come back to it. I think I might just pass the floor to Nadine again for a few minutes now, because we can make some links to your research as well, Nadine, when it comes to the modern period and the way in which fine art schools in Egypt did influence modern art learning. There are also some issues linked to access and individual trajectories within the arts arena. I think when we spoke in the past, we've looked a lot about your work on defining fine arts in Egypt, particularly looking at the colonial and post-colonial context. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that and some of the influences on your work and your study, and how some of the most recent transitions and changes have come in. Yes, so the fine arts school that we mentioned before can be investigated in terms of the question of whether or not it's a colonial institution. There are, of course, European links. In Egypt, the founding of this school wasn't a specifically colonial project as such. It's a little bit more complicated. At the beginning, Joseph Kemé was the individual who actually floated the idea and financed the project for this school. And then the management was actually handed over to a French sculptor. At the beginning of the 21st century, this was. So Egypt was a real colonial melting pot, if you like, with an Ottoman presence, a French presence, an Italian presence as well, and a British administration. So there were lots of different influences in play, and the first team that actually managed the school, the first professors, were European. The students were Egyptian, and there was a project to actually teach these students to produce arts in terms of expressing Egyptian identity. So this was the original idea. They learnt Western art forms and artistic techniques, but the idea was that they were going to convey their experience as Egyptians. So they would paint Egypt, if you like. That was the idea. And I have a colleague who's looked a lot at this issue and tried to show the hybrid element of this. So all the different influence that came in and the emergence of modern artistic expression in Europe. And the idea was to look at the appropriation of European artistic techniques and bring in applied arts techniques from Egyptian knowledge.
So the first Egyptian director of the school came only in 1937, so almost 30 years after it opened. It was the painter Nagui, and I would add, going back to the history of women there, at the same time, even before that, in the 1920s, they organized themselves in feminist organizations, especially with Roda Shanarab. And from the 1920s onwards, they opened schools to teach the arts to women, but in a more artisanal fashion. There was a Egyptian feminist union, and they gave women in the popular classes to learn these practices. But this was more from remuneration purposes. The Egyptian Feminist Union at the same time ran a campaign for women to be admitted to the fine arts school. They tried several times, and in 1930 this was accepted on principle, meaning that society could accept the idea, but the person who then accepted it changed roles for whatever reason, and the principle was forgotten until 1930. And it was not until 1938 that the demand came about again. The feminist arguments need to be placed within the framework of the time, meaning that Egypt was undergoing decolonialization, and so women being admitted to fine arts school is part of a whole campaign to improve the conditions of education for women in Egypt at the time. The main argument being that educating women is a part of national emancipation. This is a recurring argument that is seen within the intellectuals during the Arab Renaissance. And it is part of the Amin rhetoric. Amin being a legal worker and one of the feminist voices of Egypt, who says that by education and the emancipation of women, this can lead to a nation where all individuals are emancipated and able to think for themselves. Thus, it is for the common good of constructing a new emancipated country. The process of decolonialization, the struggle of this, played a central role in this demand for access to these educational institutions. And from the 1930s onwards, little by little, the institutions were opened up to women. Following 1938, after a speech by Susanna Barrow, one of the feminists of the Egyptian Feminist Union, following the speech, this acceptance happened, and in her speech, she pledged the peaceful mission of the arts, as well as arts by women as a useful tool. There were some stereotypical arguments of artistic women and the decoration aspect of women. But before 1938, there was the development of an institute for women to learn fine arts. This institution has two different names, but it really meant it was an educational arts institute, first to teach drawing teachers, women teachers, because women could either learn applied arts at that time or become drawing teachers. But the difference between that and fine arts is that this was governmental, and the educational team, the teachers, they were all Egyptians trained in England, but the courses were in Egyptian, and the aim was to replace the drawing teachers who were already there in the primary and secondary educational institutions who were all British. So the artistic development of Egyptians and women became governmental, and this created a big difference compared to the men's trajectory within the institution of fine arts. This institute is part of an Egyptianization process of the educational institutions. So within the framework again of decolonialization. Within the institutes, the directors and everybody modified the teaching methods before they prioritized ways of doing things that pertain to children at school. So they taught art to women in the same way that it was taught to children. So, for example, they just copied postcards. There were no models. There was a grid, and we still do this for children, by the way. It was about producing an identical reproduction of a drawing within a grid, and the professors slowly rejected such methods to then prefer free expression and the development of the artistic practices on a professional level as well as personal expression, not just what was then considered as the good training of a good housewife from a certain society. Finally, in 1951, 1952, around that time, women accessed the fine arts, and they went via a competition to follow mixed education with all the advantages. There are advantages to a co-education, both for training, but also in terms of the social life, the exchanges, the networking, meeting people where one can exhibit, that can help you exhibit and sell. Obviously, the nude classes were challenging. This was why women were kept away from the fine arts, because they should not be within a room with nudes. It would be scandalous. This was the argument in many countries. This is the delay that we have within colonial history in terms of teaching men and teaching women. You talked about this a little, and also in previous conversations we've talked about a general point that I find quite interesting that affects your research, and that's the complex relationship between the movements as well as the trajectory of different stakeholders together, along with the infrastructure inherited from colonialism. It reminds me of Yasmina Lagad's project. She was here just a few days ago in this forum. We dreamt of utopia and we woke up screaming. She talks about the infrastructure of the radio. There is a focus on art schools, which were then adapted almost as poetic levers within the framework of new political objectives. And on state level, it was about the project of independence, which was often modernistic and, of course, nationalistic. Potentially this could be described as failed because of the mechanisms that are close to the colonial education systems. At the same time, during these years of independence, there were new trajectories opened up, both within and outside of the different institutions that were already established. What's interesting, I think, is to explore the different experiences and trajectories. And so, Nadine, perhaps you could tell us more about some specific trajectories of artist women who navigated the systems, especially the institutional systems of the fine arts schools, and the emancipation or the detraction from emancipation that they experienced. Well, yes, for example, there's an artist, one of the most famous ones in Egyptian modern art, known as Flotoun. She was known as a feminist and communist activist. She was one of the first women to go to public university in Egypt, if I remember well. She went to the Lettres University. She was a member of the aristocracy. And this was quite a rare thing to see aristocratic women at a governmental public university. And she was actually trained in the arts received her training from private tutors, which I explained before. She was born in 1924. She was a part of the generation who saw the arrival of the institution and the opening up of the fine arts, but started her training before. She had private tutors. She had a professor who probably came to her school, a famous artist, and her family gave her the opportunity to go to the art school in Paris, as they often go to France, but she refused. She refused for nationalistic reasons. She felt it was important to stay within the local institutions. And so she continued to train in other private studios, namely with a Swiss artist. She trained with Mohamed Ramdallah and Tahem Halim, painters who had private studios. And when the fine arts became co-ed, she did not strictly integrate the main circuit, but she attended night school in what was called the free section. This free section was meant to allow everyone, especially those who worked within the day, to follow classes in the evening. She worked in the day, yes, and so she then found herself in a very socially varied and culturally varied class. And the press described her classes as almost like a UN meeting because there was such a diversity of nationalities. And so this is quite an exemplary trajectory of a woman navigating the scene prior to the opening of fine arts to women. Then, even once the fine arts were open to women, it was no simple thing. Let me give you the example of one of the first women who received a diploma in painting, Ms. Hussein. She's a painter who was barely known. I hardly found any information on her apart from a series of press articles about her who were interested in her story. She received her diploma for the first time in 1953, and she worked in a psychiatric hospital to obtain her diploma. So let us imagine this young woman going to some local hospital in Cairo, where she painted a whole host of canvases of the depicting the psychiatric hospital. Unfortunately, I haven't found any pictures of it. I'd love to see. She painted people with their hair in disarray, in odd positions, in strange rooms, but she was censored by the diploma jury, and so she was not able to obtain her diploma for moral reasons, because her work did not respect tradition. Thus, she had to rework her portfolio. She presented her candidacy once again, having camouflaged the body parts that disturbed, and finally she obtained her diploma. But what was quite tragic was that same year in 1953, one of her colleagues called Sabrera, who this is a man who actually became a portrait painter that was quite renowned in Egypt. He also presented a project talking about the women of the night. This is a series of paintings of prostitutes, but he had no issues presenting. He was lauded, and he received his diploma. So you can see this double speed within the institution, even after women were admitted.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting story, isn't it? An interesting look at how women came into the art school, and some of the things that actually fed in the post-independence era. There were obviously some Western influences at play, but also a lot of interesting projects from different schools that perhaps influenced the fine arts school. Um, there were also certain spaces, I think, growing up, weren't there, for production and for artistic exchanges. So perhaps the community element of things came in. I wanted to ask you maybe to share some experiences from both of your contexts and both of your works now, um, linked to the various forms and spheres that perhaps came in to influence the schools in the more modern time. There is actually a tension that exists between art schools as such, or the vision that we can have of them today, and the social and political context of the African continent, particularly Western Africa and countries that have spaces that have gone through the colonialization process. So I think there's this tension, this quite interesting um, link between the fact that official schools were often created in the 1950s. In Nigeria, for example, the first Nigerian College of Art was introduced in 1952 within the very much a context of students claiming their right to have this university branch. In Senegal, this was 1948, the first arts and music and dramatic arts college founded in that country. So this was more of a music school and dance school, but there was an artistic element of it as well. This was created by a lawyer. Um, so this 1948 was the date, as I said, and after a few years, there was a whole reform that went on through the president, and then the National School of Art was created in Senegal. There was actually a link with Mali and Bamako as well. There's another example I can take in Congo. The first academy, the it was in 1942 under the Mobutu regime, and this included classes in ceramics, painting, and decoration, and also advertising and other disciplines like that. And so there were more institutional schools set up and initiated by the state, with quite a lot of foreign influence, and then other more informal forms of school that were created perhaps more through local artists or individuals who were already practicing on a local level. There were also some painting schools that came in that were really influenced by Europeans. So Pierre Lord, for example, set up the first painting school that's really recognized in Western Africa. Um, this individual had an art workshop in his own house, his own premises, and he actually therefore had the idea of expanding and actually founding an art school, encouraging Congolese people who were interested in arts to really express themselves through drawing and painting and represent Africa through their eyes. So this was a different way of influencing the arts scene and the arts education arena. There are other examples of these ways in which artists lay claim to their own African identity through art. Uh, we can look at European masters or teachers who came in and who influenced these schools, but who were very much looking to a modern arts type of teaching. In Nigeria, there's a group of students who I studied who actually decided to form a collective in order to really counteract some of the dominant currents. Not in a necessarily in a radical sense, but to introduce a new, more local way of looking at artistic production. In 1958, Utiokeke with Simone Keke and Dimasimuku, some of these students actually got together and decided to formally found a society, the Nigerian Arts Society. And they set up a whole program. It was an informal program linked to really reconciling artistic traditional practices and Western arts practices. This was linked to post-colonial modernism as a school, and in Cameroon there are also examples from the 1980s. For example, Minin Muputa and Meduta, created by an artist who was presented as really the father or pioneer of Cameroon modern art. Um, this individual set up an artistic circle, including Wikin Kangola, who unfortunately died very recently, I think 2 weeks ago, Samuel Hebile, and other artists. These individuals got together to actually form associations, and they called this the Liberal Arts School. The focus was on sharing and caring and solidarity. So, not just artistic practice in isolation, but really forging links within the post-colonial context. It was still obviously in its infancy, really. So the idea was to really forge these links with artistic laboratories. Isassin formed one of these linked laboratories. There were also societies for performers and writers, and the idea was to transform the artistic nature of production and go away from the more formalist currents. So to go over and above what was already being produced, to go into a more experimental realm, separating themselves from art as it had been produced up until that point. These were some of the ways that I think collectives and individuals actually came in to really transform the artistic context and try to create an alternative to the more traditional institutions within the African context. Thank you very much. Lots of information. It's a very dense topic of study, isn't it, with all these specific examples and influences that come in. We're arriving towards the end of our session today. So I just wanted to see if there are any comments or questions now from our audience. Please don't hesitate to write in the chat box if you have anything you'd like to ask or any comments to make, and then we can ask Nadine and AUDE. Let's just have a look. I'll see if I can read the box now, the chat box. So there's something coming from Joshua, and I'm going to read this in English for you.
Thought-provoking presentations. A question for Nadine. I've read that the Egyptian avant-garde in the 40s were becoming wary of the structures of nationalist frameworks for art making, which I understand were historically associated with the Nada paradigm and the École des Beaux-Arts in Cairo. Did these concerns about nationalism in art temporarily dissolve during the Nasser period, or how did women artists navigate these debates? I imagine some women artists may have felt caught between belonging in the national community fostered by the state and, on the other hand, belonging to a progressive art community fostered by the avant-garde.
Thank you, Josh, for this question. Je vais répondre en français parce que je sais qu'il y a une interprétation. En fait, je pense que les avant-gardes dont tu parles, c'est spécifiquement le groupe Art et Liberté, qui est un groupe qui est rattaché au surréalisme à l'international et qui effectivement se révolte contre cette tendance nationaliste dans les arts modernes en Égypte et notamment au Salon du Caire, qui est le salon organisé annuellement par la Société des Amis de l'Art, qui fait un peu office de salon de l'Académie. Enfin, ce serait un équivalent si on veut comparer avec les structures européennes pour dire c'est un art quand même soutenu par les élites et par le pouvoir en place. Mais cette tendance nationaliste, en fait, elle ne se dissout pas du tout pendant le nasserisme. Au contraire, à partir de donc la révolution en 1952 et plus particulièrement de 56 avec l'arrivée de Nasser comme président et 58 la constitution du ministère de la Culture, le régime met vraiment la main sur toutes les formes d'expression. Alors la presse est nationalisée, les artistes sont recrutés pour travailler au service de l'État, notamment à travers des bourses de production qui leur permettent de s'affranchir des en fait, ce sont des bourses, c'est comme un salaire sur un an ou plusieurs années qui leur permettent de s'affranchir des impératifs économiques et de travailler librement. Des missions de voyage, notamment au Égypte, pour documenter la Nubie au moment où on crée le haut barrage à Aswan et les terres nubiennes sont inondées. Des missions pour aussi promouvoir la construction du barrage comme un grand progrès technique qui va apporter l'électricité, réguler l'eau, etc. sur le territoire. Donc il y a vraiment une campagne de propagande qui est menée par l'État, mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'on doit nécessairement considérer que tout art produit en Égypte à cette période est un art nationaliste. C'est beaucoup plus compliqué que ça, c'est des parcours individuels. Les femmes, comme les hommes, ont bénéficié de ces bourses dont je parle. Elles ont été sollicitées dans les différentes missions.
There's a lot of individual contacts that came in as well, showing specific individuals who actually tried to counteract these propaganda trends. There were certain paintings actually produced showing abstract ways of counteracting the very mechanical production that had been encouraged. So there were some quite interesting currents that I think is something I'd like to look into. It's very simplistic to really try to consider artists within this dictatorial or controlled context. It's something that I feel did have a big influence on many of the big names. Nationalism was something that could be correlated with a decolonialization process. There was a kind of intimate political link here. And I think this did affect the arts world, and the resistance movements that were being set up did actually exist. There were artists that were thinking that they did not want to become state artists. Perhaps I know it's not the heart of our exchange at the moment, but I could have a lot to say on this. I think maybe I should wrap up there. So I think Dominique is asking a question now as well. Dominique's been looking at some of the contexts that you're investigating as well, and wants to know about design and whether or not there's a specific design element that we can look at here, perhaps with regard to specific artistic pathways, education, design education specifically.
Dans le cadre de ma recherche, je ne me suis pas intéressée à une discipline particulière.
In this case, it's not particularly about design, but if I had to refer to the design practice and how it is practiced by artists on the scene in the 70s and 80s. I'd say that design is not how we see it today, but rather it started with painting for advertisements. That was the first time where we saw such a practice to make money, to earn a living. In my research, I don't have much access to this information. On my end, it's the same. I cannot really speak of design, but know that in the fine arts school, one does talk of decor. There's a department. It's still there where one learns about interior design, the design of objects, and graphic design. And so there's a certain number of artists, I suppose, who came about through these circuits. And then there's the School of Applied Arts. It's a little bit more it's a little bit older. I do not know it well. We have another question now by Mina, who is wondering whether you have examples of informal or formal links between the different schools you mentioned in your presentations, and are there traces of exchanges and influences, especially surrounding big events such as the festivals in 1966 in Dakar or 77 in Lagos, or even via journals and magazines? Do you have any references to this end? Aude, I'm giving you the mic there. I'm trying to think of an answer in my head. In terms of formal links, I don't know. I'm not able to put together a response. Pardon? Are there maybe different types of exchanges and collaborations between, for example, if I understood well, between schools in Western Africa and, for example, the schools in Egypt or within the different regions? In Egypt, let me answer quickly. I think, no, I don't know them so well, but I know that there are students from India, namely, or from unaligned countries who come to study for a semester or a year in Egypt. Now, I don't know the frameworks. There are exchanges, there are grant systems that go both ways, actually. A student from the educational institute went to India for a year, is going to India for a year. I have many traces of trips made by Egyptian female students who went to study the fine arts abroad in a formal way. Then there being formal ties between two establishments specifically, nothing springs to mind, although I'm sure there might have been. In my own research, most of the links were made on a local level. So, for example, in Cameroon, together with collectives in Douala and Yaoundé, there was an exchange in terms of the organization of local events. For example, like the festival. There were exchanges of this type. There was a group of artists in Yaoundé where there were more students from the University of Yaoundé. there was this type of exchange, but I, to my knowledge, do not know that there were exchanges, for example, between Central Africa and Western Africa, for example, Ghana. No, not to my knowledge. But there were exchanges between artists in Cameroon and abroad. They went abroad and then locally went trained other artists upon their return. But that's still a link between the West and Africa. But within the framework of Africa, even to this day, it remains a problem because there isn't much exchange between the countries. It's beginning. This is beginning, but to my knowledge, not yet. I mean, there was an exhibition on exchange recently between, quote unquote, the third world and the second world as well. There was a lot of collaboration to this end within the educational institutions, within the entire communist sphere, and then between the different countries who became independent. This was both for people with technical profiles, engineers and such, but also artists. In fact, there is work that traces back collaborations, and as a reference, indirectly, for Amina, if she does not know, she could potentially find answers in a project that was carried out a few years ago called Modernité Nomadic Modernity, which traces the various trajectories that existed over different territories, especially around that type of period. Now, I've received a quick private message from Olivia, who is our super assistant for the 154 forum, and she is saying that we should really begin to wrap up. I would like to invite AUDE and Nadine to say anything, if you have any final comments to make, perhaps on the present day and the spaces for learning. If there's anything you would like to share very briefly, I would give you the floor before we wrap up. The current situation, the Cairo Fine Arts School still exists, and the Institute for the Young Women has undergone many fusions and remoldings. There is an artistic educational establishment, and now today it's not so much about a colonial or non-colonial establishment, but rather these places are criticized of being somewhat obsolete, and they have not updated their ways of teaching. Neither are they sufficiently training students so that they can integrate the contemporary art scene on an international level. So the dynamic is somewhat reversed. What's regrettable is that they are not open enough to the rest of the world, and not enough tools are provided to integrate the world scene. Therefore, this dynamic has really changed.
privées.
There are also some private initiatives, in particular Mass Alexandria, which was founded by Waisho, the artist, and there's an English language teaching program there. SILAS, the Cairo Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences. There's the Mekutke University with a plastic arts department. But all these examples are teaching in English with some Egyptian teachers who come in, some invited teachers. The program can be quite diverse. Benami, for example, was involved. We could ask various questions about the way in which these programs are organized, and I think there are some issues that come up here on a social level. They're paid programs, so there's a question of access as well.
Ouais, je crois que tu peux
Yes,
continuer
yes, I think
sans
I can maybe
que
just
le
continue what
post-colonialisme
Nadine
regarde
said by saying I
les
am
différentes
asking some of the same
formes
questions with regard to the different
institutionnelles de
forms
transmission
of
de l'art et de la vie.
institutional
Mais
art
sans pour
transmission
autant, il
today.
y a bien
It's
plein de
important to
projets qui
say
sont
that there are a lot of
soutenus
projects
ou qui
that
peuvent être
are
intéressants. L'exemple
being
de
set up at the
ASICO,
moment. For
qui est
example,
fondé par
ASICO,
Vicky
which was
Silva,
founded
qui est
by
un très
Mrs.
beau
Silva.
projet.
It's a
J'espère qu'il
great
continuera.
project. I think it will. I
Pour
hope it will be able to
réussir vraiment
continue.
cet accent
The idea was to really place the emphasis
rechercher
on
des
looking to research
théoriciens
into
français
theorists,
qui essaient
thinkers,
à parler des
that really
questions
talked a lot
de
about
l'art,
the
l'histoire,
African
question de
art
l'histoire de l'art,
context, the issue of
mais
African art
tout en
history, etc.
en créant les échanges entre
Through
les
creating
différents pays sur le
links
continent.
between the different
Et en fait,
countries on our continent.
c'était un programme qui se
This
baladait.
is a
Et moi,
program
ce que ça
that
m'a
went from place to
intéressant, c'est
place as
que
well. So
c'était
it's
un
very
organisation qui
interesting to
va
look
loin
at the
de
way in which this
l'apprentissage des classes
particular
pour
program went
aller
outside the classroom
véritablement
context
rencontrer
to try
d'autres
to really go
étudiants,
to
un
uh,
contact plus
other
proche à ce
environments,
contexte de l'art,
closer to other contexts,
mais
other
ce sont des
artistic
formes qui permettent
contexts.
d'intégrer
These are
plus
forms of
d'aspérités,
teaching
des
which I
formes
think
aussi
should
plus
be
homogènes
an
qui
inspiration
vont
for
permettre
us.
cette
More
multiplication
homogeneous arts
qu'il y a
teaching
entre les différentes
forms,
disciplines
so we
artistiques
can
et
have
qui
this
soit
interdisciplinarity and
euh,
try to be more homogeneous
donc
and look at local and community
merci.
contexts. And thank you very much for the opportunity today. Thank you. Thanks very much to both of you for your sharing and some fruitful exchanges. We're looking forward to our last event with a film to share with you soon as well. I'd like to therefore thank all those involved today, the organisers, the speakers. I'd like to thank the fair and Olivia in particular, who helped us set this all up. She's really worked hard behind the scenes, so I'd like to thank her for all the time she's spent preparing and presenting our conversations. I'd also like to thank all the listeners today for being with us, our audience, and all those who have participated in the various meetings that we've organised. I think that's it. I'd like to wish you all a lovely afternoon. Thank you once again. And for those who are following us in Marrakech, we'd like to invite you to another event on the 18th. At the 18, you know, our site for our next exhibition, AUDE. So for those of you who can join us, that would be fantastic. So thank you once again, and thank you, Francesca. Thank you, and hope to see you soon.